Hey, so a couple people on Twitter had asked me to give a session overview and explain how I made some of these aquatic creature vocalizations that I recently posted online. So I figured I'd just do a quick breakdown of the session and explain what's going on. So I should probably start by mentioning that a lot of the inspiration for my approach comes from Ash Reed's talk on the creature sound design for Returnal. I'll link that in the description below. But essentially, Ash talks about how him and the team approach creating the sounds and some kind of benchmark design approaches that he used, such as having a start, having a sustained element, and then an end section. That way you can kind of relay a lot of important information to a player in the context of games, or in a film, you can give some kind of forewarning to the sound effect to come. So it can be helpful to break your sounds up into those three categories. Starting at the top, we've got an LFE bus that just plays this short, bassy impact sound. So that LFE section layers with this impact bus here, because even though I was creating creature vocalizations for whatever reason, I decided to add an impact sound. So these are made up of several different, what I call sputter textures, which are just these kind of wet, liquidy sci-fi sounds that are very modern. I designed these in an earlier session and just threw them in and adjusted the playback rate, and did the same for this kind of transient that I've got here. So initially these all sounded like this. And then after adjusting them and then layering them with the LFE, it sounds like this. It's a little dirty, loses some of the transient fidelity, but I think it works in the context of this design. So then starting with the bookend start, as you can see, just a lot of humpback whale cries, pitched and stretched down. I think these come from Boom's Alien Life sound library. So here's how these sound. I then added some crystallizer just to add a little bit more depth to things, kind of create these little granular echoes that make it seem a bit larger than life and to me fit the aquatic theme. And then I've got a Console 1 plugin. This is linked to a piece of hardware that I have in front of me that basically acts as a channel strip. So it's got a filter section, it's got a transient shaper, an EQ, a compressor, and a saturation drive. And basically the knobs in front of me control this plugin. So unfortunately, I can't really show you a top-down view of all that, but as you can see here, I'm just cutting some of the lows in the EQ section, dipping out some of the low mids and some of the upper mids and treble. And then I'm just doing a little bit of drive just to saturate things. So here's before, then after. Just a little thicker, a little bit louder as well. And then that brings us to the sustain bus, which is the bulk of the sound. We've got some humpback whale cries. We've got more of that sci-fi sputter stuff, chihuahua growls, bubbles, gurgling, and yeah, more whale stuff going on. So without any processing, here's how all this sounds. And then with processing, just a little louder, a little cleaner, a little rounded out. Just some slight EQ around 1K to clean up some of the mid-range, cut off some of the low lows, and then going through an LA2A just to add a little bit of warmth and some invisible compression, which is how I think of this plugin. And then that leads us to the bookend end. So this is kind of the end of the sound to indicate to the player, the listener, whatever the context is, that sound is coming to an end. And it's just more whale cries, seal groan, and a door hinge creak. So this seal kind of snarl aligns with the impact. So that's kind of the reason that I arbitrarily threw that in. It sounds a little random in context, but when you play it all together, you can hear it line up with the LFE and the impact sound. And then we've got the slime, which is kind of just the sweetener layer. I wanted things to feel a bit more wet, more aquatic, and just add some texture overall. So we've got some borax slime, and then there's also this, what is this, obnoxious sip straw, whatever that is. So it looks like I've got some distortion. Without that, it sounds like this. With the distortion. And then all together. Once again, I've got Console 1, just doing a little bit of high cut and low cut, compression, EQ, cleaning up the low end and the low mids, and then some saturation. And then all of that together through the processing is just a little bit thicker, a little slimier. And then, yeah, play it all together. It sounds like some sort of aquatic creature. The mix bus itself, there's not a ton going on. I'm using this Metric Halo mixed plugin, which is an emulation of an old hardware unit, which was a digital tape saturation processor. This recently came out and has become popularized because Serban Ganea, who's a well-renowned pop mixer, he still uses the hardware unit, and so they decided to make a plugin after it, and this thing just sounds great. It's very simple. You could dial in the input gain, drive it to get a little bit of saturation and some compression, and then if some of the top end tapers off, you've got this high frequency adjust knob, which is great. What I really love about this plugin is that a lot of tape processors will naturally attenuate the top end a little bit to emulate that tape sound of making things a little bit darker and dirtier. But because this is a digital tape saturation plugin, it's a lot cleaner and it retains that top end more. So to me, it's just a little bit more modern sounding. I then go through Snap Heap, where I've got some comb filtering going on, and then an envelope follower is driving the frequency and the mix rate just a little bit. So just sneaking this into taste to add some more movement. We've got some distortion, just lightly mixed in, disperser around 150 hertz, and then a nonlinear filter where, once again, this envelope follower is just driving the cutoff. So after that, we're just hitting a limiter really lightly to contain things. And then from there, I'll usually play the sound. And then I will grab the section that I like. In this case, the whole sound. And then I'll load up something like Faceplant, where I can then drag the sound in to Faceplant and then create a patch from it. So you could either load it into the sampler module or the granular generator, which is what I decided to use. And then from here, I'm really just pitching the sound down a little bit, modifying some of the granular settings, and then adding effects to taste. So in this case, I went a little crazy with some flanging, some disperser, a comb filter that's being driven by an envelope follower. We've got a nonlinear filter that's also being driven by that same envelope, distortion, a little bit of delay to make things bigger, and doing some pitch shifting based on a pitch tracker. So all of these modules enable the sound to have infinite variety every time I trigger this from MIDI. And to me, it's just a lot more intuitive than taking all of these layers and then copy pasting them further down in your session and slightly tweaking certain things. If you load it in a Faceplant like this, every time you trigger a MIDI note, when you've got all this sorts of modulation going on, you're going to get variations very naturally. I also set up grain speed macro so that I can kind of adjust this and map this to a MIDI controller and just kind of play with those knobs and again, create more variations. And the same thing is going on for the pitch of the sound. Here are some examples of some sounds that you can generate just by playing some MIDI notes through a patch like this, set up with these sorts of parameters. Or we could play them really, really low. Then start tweaking the macros up top. So if you get a little too heavy-handed, you can hear that things start to lose their tonality and become more like textures rather than readable vocalizations. But I think that can be a good thing, depending on what you're after. So again, I really recommend trying out this approach where you just design a sound the bulk of the way and then throw it in a Faceplant and start just triggering notes all across the MIDI keyboard and see what you can come up with.